Urban Squeeze.
Well, we talk a bit of town planning, living in the big bad city. Really, Associate Professor Jason Byrne, Dr. Tony Matthews, both urban planners with the School of Environment at Griffith University for the final time this year. Gentlemen, hello.
Good afternoon, Matt.
Hello, Matt.
Tony, good to see you here as well. Talking about living on the coast, I mean, it's one thing to talk about living in the city, but living in a coastal city is another thing altogether. I can't let this opportunity slip, though, without sharing with you a little of what Doug Parkinson had to sing about living near the Gold Coast a few years ago now.
Every day's a holiday and everybody lives for the sun. For Australia, the Gold Coast always been the one, the only.
See, that's from the 80s, early on, but it's a much more complicated type of existence here on the Gold Coast. Now, it is not just a holiday village. It's a city and it has all that goes with it. So for this final edition of Urban Squeeze, I thought we'd talk about the Gold Coast as a city, specifically on the coast, and the challenges and the peculiarities from a planning perspective of living by the sea. Is that a fair way to summarise?
I think so.
Yeah,
It's a great
right,
place
so.
to start.
Jace, you begin.
So, Matt, it's almost like the paradigmatic new city.
Say that again.
It's like a paradigm, like a new city, a new kind of city for the 21st century, the Gold Coast. It's a tourism city. It's for a long time it's been thought of as a kind of part of a 200-kilometre long metropolis, a conurbation along the coast. It's different to other cities. It seems to be leisure-based, tourism-based, and yet real people live here, right, doing real kinds of jobs. When we think about the Gold Coast, we can put it in a national context. So about 6% of Australians live within 3 kilometres of the coastline, which is quite amazing when you think about it.
Yeah.
When you expand that out, Tony was observing before, Tony, that the majority of Australians are urban, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it always kind of makes me laugh a little. The idea that the sort of frontier image that you have of this country that has been so with us for so long, that doesn't hold true anymore. The vast majority of people, about 90% of Australians live in cities, and nearly all of those cities are coastal. So we're all actually, for the most part, coastal dwellers, whether or not we care to appreciate that. And looking beyond that, we're almost all urban dwellers. So we're coastal urban dwellers, and that's a very important thing to consider about ourselves, and it's something that probably people don't freely think about.
Yeah, what are the ramifications of that? About the social, the economic, the way we self-perceive as coastal. How does it help identify ourselves? Because you're right, we are wild colonial folk, really, aren't we? You oldie types.
Kind of funny, right?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you played something from the 1980s. There's a great book that came out in 1987 by Fisk, Hodge and Turner called Myths of Oz. And they were looking at these kind of iconic myths that have haunted our collective psyche, our collective imaginary. And they identified, like Tony said, the idea of the outback frontier stock person, the stockman, the Jillaroo, the Jackaroo, the bush ranger, the Anzac struggling digger and mateship, this kind of stuff. But alongside that was the idea of the surf lifesaver and the beach, and they were pointing to the fact that the beach is large in the Australian imaginary. It defines us as what we are as a country. There's even a art exhibition on at the moment in Australia around Impressionist art and the beach, so it looms large.
I'd actually sorry to jump
No,
in,
go
but
for it.
I'd say it actually, as somebody that didn't grow up here, I've lived here for a long time now, but as somebody that didn't grow up here, I think a lot of the world looks at this country as inherently coastal and thinks Australia equals beaches, equals people
It's
with
just
suntans.
one big beach.
It's just, and that's a huge international impression of this country, and not unrealistic, but I think that's one way that people really do think of us.
We can put some numbers on it. You mentioned the economics. So the Gold Coast has 50-odd kilometres of beaches. The estimated annual value of its beaches in a 2008 report was $400 million per annum. The council spends somewhere around $10 million per annum on coastal maintenance work, including planting coastal dunes, these kinds of things. So that's a pretty good return on investment when you think about it, if we're generating...
Neat little, $390 million profit there or thereabouts?
Pretty tidy, hey? So it's also estimated that residents make around 35 million visits to the beach per annum. This is Gold Coast residents. That's about 63 trips each per year. And that's not including the 11.5 million tourists who come to the city every year.
And trample the sand as well.
Right, who come here to see the beach. So certainly part of our economic engine and part of our social engine, right, Tony?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, you know, the proximity to the sea has many other implications as well in terms of, you know, using the sea as a resource, and the whole seafood industry, the fishing industry. You've got massive, well, you had once upon a time big shipbuilding industries here as well. We might in future have submarine building industries instead, but so I mean, this country is inherently connected to the sea, and not just in terms of a leisure pursuit, but also in terms of its economic value, which Jason was just talking about.
Are we doing enough to protect our investment?
That's a really good question. So, you know, we've done some stuff on the Gold Coast that's been world first. We've had a world first sand bypass system that was constructed in the 1980s again. That music really is appropriate.
Should we squeeze in a little Doug just for good measure?
So
Why
this
not?
is-
There he is. Yeah. Sand bypassing going on as Doug was humming those few bars. Yes.
Indeed. So this is the Delft Hydraulics lab out of the Netherlands. Came up with a world first engineering feat in enabling us to build these kind of training walls to stabilise the entrance to the Broadwater. And then they had to bypass the sand that built up along the southern side of those training walls. So they bypassed basically 500 cubic metres per hour. That's 500,000 cubic metres of sand per annum, roughly. It cost $50 million when it was built, and estimates are that there's been about 16 million cubic metres of sand bypassed through that system. So It's a world first. And that technology has been exported to Japan and South America and South Africa since.
Okay.
So there's a really good example of some positive stuff that's been coming out. But Tony and I have always been kicking around some of the negative things. That
Yeah, unfortunately, when you start talking about coastal management, people do get a little bit twitchy, let's just say. So that's a plus.
That's a plus.
Can't help but talk about the negatives, though, because there are some.
Well, yeah. I mean, the more medium term looming problem is sea level rise, which we're going to start seeing in a very pronounced way sooner, probably again than people realise by mid-century, certainly by end of century. It's this. Let's just say that the ocean frontage here is going to look a lot different in a couple of decades from what it does now. That's a big threat. We have a few other things then to worry about, and you know, I don't wish to be gloomy, but increased cyclonic activity, more storm surges, more erosion, ocean acidification, beaches taking a hammering, beachfront property being vulnerable, perhaps to the point of collapse into the sea. So the future is perhaps not necessarily as rosy, and I'd like to say that we're planning for it and doing great work to make sure that we ride that storm, but we're not, frankly.
Long-term planning is never a strength when governments are only in power for, 3 or 4 years
3 to 4
at a
years.
time.
Particularly when it's tied into people's perception of their value of their property.
So
James?
I'm going to risk offending council. I've been very good this year and not offending council, but I might have to observe that it gets a bit hard when you've got an organisation that on the one hand is issuing development approvals and then on the other hand is reaping a return from those approvals through increased rates. So some people are starting to suggest we might need some kind of third-party oversight of this.
Really?
Yeah, and when you see this on the coast, these numbers start to stack up, especially when we think about climate change. So nationally, there's been an estimate that between $90 and $300 billion of property are at risk from climate change. On the Gold Coast, there was a report by the Department of Climate Change in 2009 suggesting that somewhere between 2,500 to 5,000 properties are at risk from just a 1 metre sea level rise. And that's guaranteed almost by the end of the century. We're probably looking at more than that. And let's put a number on this. Every 1 metre up on a sandy coastline like ours means 100 metres inland of coastal erosion. So you think about the coast, you think about those multi-million-dollar houses we have on Hedges Avenue and these areas, and it starts to get a bit dicey.
A bit ick.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we've got sea walls. They've been building progressively sea walls along the coastline for quite some time now, but they're not complete. The sand can get in behind them, and they can be overtopped in
You're talking about the
storm
A-line,
event. The A-line.
Yeah,
right,
well,
Tony?
the A-line is... So the A-line is a seawall that runs the length of the Gold Coast, and it's not necessarily visible to the naked eye. Mostly it's actually under the sand. But that's not going to do much for us with sea level rise. That's the value of the A-line is in managing and minimising coastal erosion, but it's not going to do an awful lot at all for sea level rise. Jason's talking about a 1 metre sea level rise by end of century. That's the... how should I put it? That's the common figure that's accepted by many policymakers. They take that from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the big international organisation that puts out their report every 7 years projecting the future under climate change. But if you look at some of the other studies out there and some of the other data, including stuff coming out of NASA, we could be looking at something much more severe than that, potentially in the range of 5 to 9 metres, which means that not just the Gold Coast has no viable future, but neither does any major coastal city anywhere in the world.
You're a happy little froggy this afternoon, aren't
Shanghai,
you, Tony Matthews?
New York.
I smiled all the way down here.
Dr. Tony Matthews and Jason Byrne with me. They're from the School of Environment at Griffith University, talking urban planning, but kind of the economics of living on the coastal fringe and perhaps raising a few matters that you haven't thought of before. Derek is from Benora Point, and he had a question. Derek, hello.
Hi.
How you going?
Good, thank you.
What did you want to say?
I was just wondering if these people had considered the economic benefit of shark nets or the disincentive for people to live on the coastal fringe if they are going to get eaten by sharks.
Fear and loathing in the greater population for things that lurk and live in the sea.
Thank you, Derek, for asking that question. If Jason doesn't mind, I'll take it on. First of all, there are shark nets deployed across most of the Gold Coast. They are already in situ, largely to protect the tourism industry from perceptions of attack. And if you do look at the facts around the shark nets on the Gold Coast, well, people here often say, well, we've got shark nets and we also have a very low incident of attack, therefore the nets are working. That's correlation, it's not necessarily causation. Most of the evidence and data out there around shark nets suggests that they're either no help or they're actually detrimental, because what they do is they tend to they attract a lot of animals swim around them and try and swim through them, turtles, dolphins, dugongs, etc., and they end up getting ensnared, and that then brings the sharks, who only have to swim underneath the nets to get to the beaches. And this idea that you deploy nets to protect people by catching and killing vulnerable species, it doesn't really stack up. So this whole kind of shark net thing, to my mind, I think is largely based on this idea that if you can create a perception of safety, then people will worry less. It doesn't have to be a reality of safety, it just has to be a perception of safety. So at best they create a perception of safety, at worst they're an ecological disaster.
Derek, what are your thoughts?
Well, perception and reality are opposing statistics. I mean, the reality of shark nets is that they deter attacks, and the reality of no shark nets is that it's a free-for-all. I mean, you know, I'm actually on the border of shark net protection and non-shark net protection, and I know where I surf. I mean, I'm a 67-year-old surfer, and I do not basically go south of Tweed Heads.
You know, Derry, I surf, and I know Matt surfs as well. And I've got a great many friends who surf. My students at Griffith University surf too, a lot of them, and we've had these discussions in class, and most of us have come to the conclusion that as surfers, we're attracted to the ocean. We would rather not have shark nets. We would rather not see dolphins getting killed, whales getting ensnared, and that, you know, it's like crossing the street. You take your risk. You are more at risk of dying in a car accident than you are from a shark attack.
Also, you're more at risk of dying of a bee sting or a donkey bite than you are of a shark attack.
Yeah, I know, but how many cars drive in the surf?
Derek, on what basis do you assert that shark nets create safety?
Since shark nets were put in on the Gold Coast, we've had one attack. Shark nets, for whatever reason, and I do not understand why the shark presence in northern New South Wales is there. I mean, there's a lot of hypotheses that come out, but they are there, and they are bumping people, nibbling people, killing people, and there's no deterrent. I mean, for want of a better situation, yes, the sharks, the only way to stop being eaten by a shark is to kill the shark.
I would have to disagree with that. Maybe not go surfing.
Yeah, that would stay out of the water. It'd probably be easier than killing a few million sharks.
We're kind of getting derailed from the economic question here, Derek. So
that's it. No.
I'm just curious, just anecdotally, if you can just humour me for a moment. Just anecdotally, among your colleagues who do surf, it's a fairly collegiate activity. What are the thoughts of the people who are using the water, who you use the water with? What are they saying?
Paranoia, anxiety.
The other thing to consider, Derek, and this kind of gets back to where Matt would like us to get back to the economic question. Another argument, and I think one that has significant validity, is actually what's happening is there's more people in the water because there's a rising population and more people living on the coast, and therefore more people are taking up water-based activities. More people in the water equals more shark attacks because there's more opportunity. And if you look at where some of the other shark attacks are happening around the southwest coast of WA, for example, again, there's a great deal of coastal development has gone on there in the last 10 or 15 years, and that has correlated with an increase in shark activity, shark attacks. So there is a fairly strong hypothesis out there that, in fact, there's no real increase in shark attacks. There's just an increase in perception of shark attacks relative to population.
Yeah, it's sort of
the case on the Gold Coast. But no, I was just interested because you were talking economics.
Yeah, I'm curious too. But you mentioned the word paranoia. I mean, that has an economic consequence, doesn't it, if it filters through to markets?
The only thing that I can sort of draw a direct comparison to, is what is happening in the Ballina region. And their ocean-orientated industries are suffering economically. And that includes surf life-saving, surfboard industries, retail, accommodation houses. And I would suggest to you that if you pull up the Sharknets on the Gold Coast and we start getting even half the amount of attack, bumping, sightings, whatever the Ballina region has, our accommodation industry will crash.
It's an observation.
So, that's just my argument.
Yeah, and it's a good conversation point too. Derek, appreciate your call this afternoon. I don't want to get bogged down entirely in Sharknets because we've got a lot of other things to discuss, but perception is a consideration. We are talking about a city that relies on, in a sense, the perception of safety to nurture itself.
Wonder if there might not be a historical parallel though here, Matt. If we think back to the early days of the 20th century, there were beach inspectors on the beach in Australia measuring people's bathing suits to make sure that they complied with what was seen as morally appropriate at the time. We were on the brink of a kind of moral panic over people having bathing suits that were too short. I mean, we might look back now with humour and kind of wonder why these guys with measuring tapes were running around on the beach. And it's because broader society was worried about the intermingling of men and women in a kind of licentious environment in the water. I wonder now if we might not look back at that kind of nanny state almost that was around at that time and wonder if the same thing's not going on in some ways with Sharknets. I mean, it's kind of personal choice. Yes, I pick up the point about perception influences economic activity potentially, but I think...
And let's not forget the fact that the Barnett government in WA abandoned their Sharknet program because it didn't work.
It didn't work.
Different views around the place based on different reasonings, etc., etc., etc. Urban Squeeze, which has got awfully nautical for the time being. We're under the sea, tangled in a shark net for the time being. That's one challenge, this idea of perception of safety, just, one simple challenge, I guess. What are some of the other challenges? You've mentioned climate change already, about choosing the coast as the place where you live, building cities on the coast.
Well, tsunami risk is one. We're in an area that Geosciences Australia knows there have been tsunamis in the past. The Gold Coast is facing out towards a very active part of the Pacific Rim around New Zealand and Fiji. If we land up with the right earthquake in the right place, we'd face a tsunami here. So that's always a risk, a very remote risk. But Japan, for example, after their tsunami, they're building a 400-kilometre long seawall at the moment that's 12 metres high, and it's going to cost them $6.8 billion over a perceived threat, a perceived risk.
Building walls is a thing at the moment,
isn't it? It's a big thing at the moment. And again, it's a matter of perception. The Japanese example that Jason cited there's very little evidence to show that that's going to work. And the Japanese already had tsunami protection walls that were in situ for some of them were in situ for 70 or 80 years. Some of them were in situ maybe for 10 or 15 that were in situ before the 2011 tsunami, and none of them survived. As soon as the tsunami hit, it just blew those walls right open. So the idea that investing $6.8 billion in 400 kilometers of 12-meter tall tsunami protection is a viable economic solution and stacks up in structural terms, again, that argument is very, very far from settled. So again, it goes back to this idea of perception versus reality.
Yeah, I was about to say it might satisfy the fears people have of the great unknown ocean and its powers, but practical effect may not be.
But that's what draws us
People.
to the coast as well, right? I mean, we love the ocean as a city. We're a coastal people. There was a report that came out in the Gold Coast Sun today, another economic consideration, which was showing that people who live near the coast are healthier than people who don't. And it was comparing and contrasting suburbs like Mermaid Beach with Upper Coomera. And if we look at the northern growth corridor of the Gold Coast, where there's affordable housing, there are also higher levels of obesity, up around
We just heard
66%.
earlier today about the obesity figure for the Darling Downs area, away from the coast, 70%.
Right.
I mean, that's outrageous.
Right, and there are very real health costs we've talked about earlier in the Urban Squeeze at the beginning of our series, and they translate for the coast too. You know, people who live near the coast are generally healthier and have more active lifestyles, so there's some big economic benefits there too.
Although I did see an interesting fact today that said if you're physically inactive, you're at a much lower risk of getting melanoma.
Yeah, well, there you go.
There's some yin and yang going on or something. The Urban Squeeze for the final time this year. Associate Professor Jason Byrne, Dr. Tony Matthews from Griffith University School of Environment. They're urban planners. We're talking about living on the coastal fringe, some of the challenges, some of the perceptions. Is it possible to find a balance between the risks attached to living on the coast, whether they be climate change, tsunami risk, whatever else, sharks, if that's your thing that you're worried about? Is it possible to strike a genuine urban planning balance between those fears and a peaceful, happy, thriving existence on the coastal strip?
I think it probably is to some degree, maybe to a large degree, and there's plenty of work going on in that area. I mean, for example, the Queensland government has the Coastal Hazards Adaptation Programme at the moment, which is being administered by the Local Government Association of Queensland. That's making $4 million available per annum to local governments in southeast Queensland to look at coastal protection and coastal hazard adaptation. So there's investment there. There's obviously some concern about that. But I was reading a critique earlier, and the argument was being made that the problem with a lot of these plans is that the plans are made, but there's no implementation policy. So this is being referred to
You
as...
just described Australian politics
Right.
broadly, didn't you?
So this is described as a plan and forget approach. So what ends up happening is people have this perception of we're safe, there's a plan, our property is safe, our property values are safe, government is doing something, but without implementation strategy, it's a false sense of safety and hope. So it's a disingenuous thing to do to a community, make them or let them believe that they're safe when in fact they're not. And whilst there is good investment into coastal hazard reduction and things like that, there is also a significant vein of this plan and forget thing happening.
And it's probably time to start acting on that and to take some of the bolder and braver decisions. So in Venice at the moment, they're building a seawall, back to the walls again, around Venice to protect it.
Can't have enough walls.
That's right. The Dutch are thinking about strategies for seawalls around the Netherlands. Maybe it's time for us to start strategically planning for a retreat back from the coast. We know 1 metre sea level is going to happen. It's inevitable. We could be going to 3 or 4. That means we'll lose most of the coastal plain. Nerang is going to be beautiful. Maybe it's time to start investing in Nerang, right?
Some
for,
beachside
seafront views.
property? Yeah.
But yeah, strategically beginning to think as a society what it would mean to retreat and how long we have and how that might look.
And the focus,
And the focus.
of our development initiatives. Yeah.
But very, very politically unpalatable and very unpopular with the community, the idea of retreat, extremely unpopular. For example, after Hurricane Sandy in New York, the state of New York offered the most affected people a state-based buyback scheme if they could take the cash and run. Basically, very few people took the cash.
Is that right?
Very, very few people took the cash.
Fascinating.
Brisbane was the same after
Brisbane was the
floods.
same. But conversely, there's planned retreat likely to start happening in Wales and the UK as soon as 2025, and that's already something that's been looked at and tested for feasibility. So we are seeing planned retreat happening in some places, but certainly I think as we move further into the century, this idea of retreat is going to have to be looked at with all seriousness.
Maybe something we can pick up on
Next year.
in 2017.
Absolutely.
We always roll from one to the other. It has been an absolute pleasure having you in and introducing you to listeners here on the Gold Coast this year, gentlemen. Associate Professor Jason Byrne, Dr. Tony Matthews. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank
Matt.
you,
It's
Matt.
been wonderful.
Yeah, we've had a great time.
Some more scintillating discussions to be had as a new broadcasting year emerges. Thanks once again.
Thank you.